Well, welcome back to Kairos Talks. This is episode number dos. So just going to tell you where we are today.
We are in Gilead today.
Yes, Gilead. So
You've never been here.
You have not. No, chances are somewhere on the East Coast or something. So we wanted to talk today. We were kind of playing around with our second video and what it's going to be about. And a question brought up to me this week. It's a great question. It's one that I think a lot of Christians are faced with, and we really want to address it. And I'll bring up the question, and in order to preface the conversation, we actually want to reference our backgrounds again too. So the question is baptism by water required by salvation? I'm sorry, is baptism by water required for salvation? And I want to specify the by water portion of this conversation because I think it's universally accepted that baptism by the Spirit is required for salvation. So, real quick, Jeff, give me a little bit of your background. How would you know about this topic?
Well, my name is Jeff, Supreme Commander, and most of my knowledge from this subject just comes from studying the Word and from just different backgrounds. But one area that I do have a little bit of a background in was I was employed by a Baptist church for a while, and that's a whole other story in its own. And I was only a custodian there, but I got to spend some time in the background with the different pastors, with the different people there, and especially some of the other custodians. And we would have those talks from time to time. And I did a lot of research into it at the time because I was working for a Baptist church. And so I do have some background in that matter. However, I would actually say that most of my knowledge on this subject comes from just my own studies and from other friends that I've spent time studying the matter with.
Cool. And, for me, Who
are you again?
I'm Chad,
Okay.
host of the show.
Not Supreme Commander.
No, co-host. Jeff, host.
Supreme Commander, host.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay,
now
cool.
we've got that settled. So, my background isn't actually particular to baptism, non-baptism. I was raised in a Baptist church, but had no idea what was going on. That's a story for another time, but I was a Christian by word. That's what I told people, but you can ask any of my friends from that time in my life. I definitely wasn't one by actions. But when I became a Christian, it was an issue that really struck home because I felt that baptism, actually at the time I was kind of the anti-position for what I am now, but I believed that baptism was something that was completely unnecessary, not important, and actually a waste of time. It's something people did only to please their parents, to be quite frank with you guys. I had family that I really believed, and I don't necessarily believe this now, but at the time I believed that they only got baptized because they were peer pressured into it, or they got baptized for someone else for some other reason. And so baptism for me growing up, I even when I became a Christian, it took me a good year or two to really come to understand it in a way that I think the Bible really talks about it in. So that's my background.
Before we even get too far into this, I do want to say that baptism is very important, and it is emphasized in the Bible. And it is a command of God that if we are believers and we are truly following Him, that we should be baptized.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as Christians, I do believe that we are to take that command seriously and that we should proceed with it. However, the real subject is, if you don't do it, are you going to hell?
Yeah, and that's, believe it or not, I've had these conversations with a couple people myself, and a lot of people just aren't willing to talk about it because it's uncomfortable, and that's why here at Kairos Talks, we are talking about it, because we want to approach the topic. Jeff and I were discussing it briefly earlier, but we first want to approach it, at least I would like to, assuming Jeff's okay with it, but we want to approach it from a logic standpoint. And we're not going to discuss it too in depth. This video log session, but we do believe in a absolute truth, and in order to have absolute truth, there must be logic, and logic has laws to it. Especially if you've taken college logic classes, you'll know. And the statement we're talking about, if you look at the opposite statement, the statement that you must be baptized in order to get to heaven, is an absolute statement. Okay? And so when we look at this statement, it means that in every example of a person going to heaven, at least from the New Testament, I don't believe the Old Testament, that's a little bit different in this instance, because we're not talking about baptism of the dead here, which is entirely another subject. But we're talking about, this absolute statement. If it is required that you have to go get baptized to go to heaven, then logic states that, or logical principles state that if we can find one counterexample to this absolute, then therefore it's no longer absolute, and therefore it's a false statement. And we don't rehearse these things, by the way. We intentionally don't, because we wanted to be super real with you guys. But we did kind of just talk about this briefly before. And Jeff, why don't you talk about the number one example, the counterexample to that statement?
Well, of course, I think one of the biggest things that people will bring up when going against this conversation is, or going against that topic, is what about the thief on the cross? And I think that is a very good point to be made, and it is one that has to be discussed honestly before you go any further. Because if you're going to make the statement, or you're going to claim that it's truth, that you have to be baptized to be saved, then you're going to have to explain the thief on the cross. And I'm more the type of guy that I prefer not to go with the most popular answer. If I can, I try to go around things. However, we have this example in the Bible of a man that died, and Jesus said that he's going to heaven. So unless you're going to say Jesus is a liar, he said, today you will be with me in paradise. Therefore, we know biblically that the thief on the cross went to heaven, and we know that he was not baptized. So we have an example of someone going to heaven who was not baptized. Now, of course, you can start getting into, it depends on where you're coming from and what you have to say next, but there could be the argument of, well, you have to be baptized as long as you have the choice. He didn't have a choice, therefore he was kind of exempt, and that's a whole other subject. We can get into all that at some point or another, but what we're really discussing is the essentials behind this. And so we have an example here of someone who died without being baptized and went to heaven. So the real question is, how does somebody who says that you have to be baptized to enter into heaven, what would they say to that? Because that is a truth right there.
No, I have heard it said, a rebuttal to that argument is that, well, Jesus is God, he can do whatever he wants. And I just want to say that that's actually not 100% accurate. God is infinite, but God has a nature. And God cannot go against his own laws and his own rules, because if he did, then he would cease to be God. And so, just because you can't have a contradiction, it can't exist, at least in the finite world.
That argument is also very counteractive, because if that's true, then yes, of course, that could work against this argument in the sense of, well, God could have made an exception there, but then at the same time, if he can do whatever he wants, and baptism is required for salvation, then he could totally go against that too.
Right.
So that's not going to work.
Right. So, yeah, see, there you go. Me playing devil advocate and losing my own devil advocate. By the way, I just want to look up the Bible reference so you guys can know that if you're not familiar with the Bible, that we're not, just spouting out stories that don't exist. You guys can turn to Luke chapter 23, verses... the thief starts at 39 and goes to 43. You can go a little bit before that too, but then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answering rebuked him and saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So even if you don't look it up, bam, it's right there. That's New King James, by the way, my preferred version. But so yeah, and so I honestly believe, and we're not going to stop the conversation here, but I really do believe that would be enough for me to say that, all right, you got me, because that's logic applied to the Bible and context considered in that equation as well. And if you can't prove something logically to me, then you lost. So I think personally that's enough for me to say, okay, you got me. Baptism isn't required for salvation. And you could, like Jeff said, we can go further into that topic, but the further you go, the more you see it's evident. But we actually want to talk about a couple other things too, because we know that may not be enough to persuade you or someone else you know. And before we go any further, I actually want to talk about the word persuade. Most people see what they want to see. It's kind of a fact of people. In the people business, you learn that. You can say whatever you want, talk as loudly or quietly or as persuasively as you want. But at the end of the day, if you have someone who's really of this opinion, I'd say most of the time, probably 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, and sometimes 9 out of 10 times, they're not going to change their opinion just because the facts say so. That's been my experience, at least. I don't know if you have a different one.
Yeah, no, I'd say that's pretty true. I'd say most of the time, even something to even understand that when talking to somebody, I think people always envision arguments and debates and discussions ending with one person conceding and actually changing to their opinion, when really that's probably like a 0.1% thing that ever happens. Most of the time, you will get two people. If you watch two people have the debate, you will kind of clearly see who wins, but you will see both people still walking away with their opinions. And what will happen is if it truly sunk in over time, the person will begin to think about it and maybe even change their opinions. I know I've done that many times myself. But you're probably not going to see an actual, like, oh, you got me, I lost, I now believe what you believe, right there on the spot.
Yeah, and I'm the same way. I'm really stubborn. But usually upon more reflection, if I'm really wrong, I'll figure it out. And if I don't, then Jeff usually corrects me anyway, so it works out.
A hammer. I'm just kidding.
So we got that one basic argument down. Another argument I would say is really interesting is that if baptism is required for salvation, why did Jesus never baptize anyone? In the entire New Testament, one of the most historically accurate books in the entire world. In fact, it is the most historically accurate book ever recorded. It has 0 errors. Why, if it's so important, if it's required for salvation, it's the key to get into heaven, why didn't Jesus baptize anyone? He talked about it. Well, he talked about baptism in and of itself, but he never baptized anyone, right? Am I correct in that, Jeff? I mean, as far as I know, he was baptized by John.
Yeah, he never baptized anybody? Not...
As far as I know.
That might be correct. I have to, I think, double check it.
As far as I've seen recorded, and I've read I've read most of Revelation, but I've read the entire Bible through, and I've never heard of Jesus physically dunking someone in water and saying, come up. And Jeff knows the Bible a lot better than I do, and he can't think of one either off the top of his head.
Not off the top of my head. Let's see, we know John was baptizing others as well.
Right, well, John baptized.
John the Baptist.
Yeah.
I thought maybe there was a record of it. I can't think of anything. Honestly, it's something I'd have to check.
Yeah. If one of you guys know, leave it in the comments. We're not afraid to be called out on our mistakes. And if I'm wrong in that, I want to be called out. So I think that point is one to consider as well. And then, do you have anything to say on that matter?
No. I think we're good.
Okay. And then I think another point that's interesting is people say there's a lot of verses about baptism, and again, we're not saying that baptism isn't important. I mean, as the saying goes, and it's a summarized version of a verse. Do you remember the verse?
Which one?
I don't know. So I was asking you.
I was just saying.
It's like 1 Peter. So it says that the exact word used is the word antitype. It says baptism is an antitype for our salvation. Or something to that effect, and I think it's like 1 Peter 3. I'll look it up when Jeff starts talking in a second. But I've heard that verse used and saying that it says baptism is a symbol for the salvation that has occurred or the grace that has occurred within. And I want to address the word antitype because the word antitype literally means a symbol. That's if you look up the word antitype, that's what it means, symbol. And so that verse is literally saying that baptism is a symbol of the grace that we received in the salvation through the baptism of the Spirit. And so the nomenclature, the saying goes that baptism is an outward expression or a symbol of the grace or the change that is occurring within one's life. And so, but I've heard that used the opposite. I've heard that same verse used in the opposite argument, saying, well, it's saying right here that baptism is required for salvation. So would you say that baptism being referred to as a symbol means and states it as a condition of salvation?
Well, I believe what baptism is that it is an outward example of what has taken place on the inside. It is a proclamation to the world of what Christ has done, that He has washed us of our sins, that we are, that our sins have been washed away, and that we are born again new. And that's why it is so important. That's why it is very important that we do that we take that step. However, again, it's what happens on the inside that is what saves us. It's what gets us into heaven. Essentially, it is that putting our faith in Christ. It is exactly what baptism is, but on the inside that our salvation is built on. So yeah, it is basically an outpouring. It is an outward example of what takes place inside of us.
So I actually found the verse. I was right. It's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21. And so give you a little preface into this. He's talking about Noah and talking about how God saved the world through water before flooding it and ridding it of sin and whatnot. And I want to read this verse because if you read the first part of it, you'll see why some people use it as an argument. But I want to caution you, never take half a verse without considering the whole thing first.
For that matter, you should really take the whole chapter.
You really should. But, I mean, don't just take half a verse, because that, if you talk about context slandering, and there is a fallacy related to that, I can't remember the name of it, but that's completely incontextual, potentially. If you're taking it in context and explaining an argument based on that, then that's a lot more reasonable. But let me read this verse to you. 1 Peter 3:21. There is also an antitype which now saves us. Baptism. Just stop there for a second. That's half the verse. There's now an antitype which saves us. Baptism. Now, to me, that sounds... it sounds like baptism saves us. But that's only half the verse. Let me keep going. It says... Oh, lost it. It says, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
So now suddenly we realize that verse is referring to something much more physical. It's actually going spiritual, and it is getting deeper than just... And it even says, not just the removal of dirt.
Not the washing of physical water.
So it takes it deeper than that. If you stopped where you first stopped, then yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, you have to be baptized to be saved. But then it goes on, and it goes a little bit deeper, and you realize, hey, this is something spiritual here, something that's happening on the inside, not necessarily something that's happening on the outside.
Right. And I think it's important to understand that baptism of the Spirit is it is found in the Bible. You read about it, you hear about it. Jesus teaches about it. Paul teaches about it all over the place. Mm-hmm. And so they're talking about baptism of water, but the word used, and I want to reference it again, and I'll put in the synonym of symbol in here. It says that there is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism. There's now a symbol which now saves us, baptism. It's not that the symbol saves us, but rather is that there is a symbol for our salvation, that is baptism. When you look at a symbol, I think of Batman. Maybe I'm just an old kid, but I think of Batman.
Okay.
When you see, you remember Batman, you got the bat signal in the sky. Now, that bat signal in the sky, it is a declaration. We need you, Batman. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
that spotlight's not going to save you.
No, the spotlight's going to save you. You see the spotlight, you're going to be mugged. You're like, I hope he's coming for me. But it doesn't save you in and of itself. It's the action of the superhero, in our example. It is the sacrifice of Jesus himself and our acceptance of that. And I'll even tie in a personal story, my personal story into this a little bit. I remember the day I was saved. And the reason I can remember that is because I remember a change occurring in here. And it was, I don't even know, words cannot accurately describe to you what happened to me. I don't know how to explain it to me. It wasn't just a sensation that I never felt before, but rather I could feel the way I was thinking, the way my thoughts were directed, the direction of my thoughts, the direction of my heart going forward with my actions. I was more focused about things concerning the betterment of other people, or the betterment of Jesus, or betterment of myself, instead of consumed with the thoughts of lust that had priorly consumed me, or the anger or this or that. My thoughts, my inner desires had started to change. And I'm not saying that, and this is a personal belief of mine, but God had been working on me before that moment in time to get me to a point where I would come to say, yo, whoa, check this out. But it happened in a moment where I suddenly realized that my heart had been prepared for this moment in time where I could accept Jesus into my heart and really start living a fresh life. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm stubborn. And I'll share this in another podcast sometime, or a video log sometime. But I said, the second I realized that this change had happened, and I really believed this moment I was saved, I said, prove it. You got 6 months. And I was talking to God. And I'll talk about that later too. But as probably blasphemous as that is, he did it. But I still believe at that moment in time I was saved. Because there's not a single thing. I think God always proves himself, but I don't think I would have been able to change the change that happened in that moment in time. Which brings us to another topic we'll talk about sometime, is once saved, are you always saved? But that's a whole other conversation.
Honestly, this topic can start spanning many, I'll just call them battlegrounds. It can start spanning many areas of the Christian faith, including Calvinism and Arminianism and many different things, but we're not going to get into all that today. I think kind of bringing it to a close here, just keeping it very simple and starting off with some very basic things that I would say, especially in talking to somebody, maybe, so let's say that you're somebody who's talking to somebody that has come up and told you, no, you have to be baptized to be saved, and you will see that in many Christian colleges, by the way. It is a very, very common ground there, but the basic area that I'd start with is, okay, well, there are two things. We have the thief who died on the cross, and he was not baptized, and he is saved. He will be in heaven. Therefore, that needs to be explained from somebody who is in support of you have to be baptized to be saved. And then the second thing is, of course, we have Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. For by grace you've been saved through faith, and not of yourselves, is the gift of God, not of works, that no man shall boast. We have a verse that specifically says works can't get you to heaven. And therefore, the physical action of baptism is a work. And therefore, we have these two things that align with each other and say that you don't need to be baptized to be saved on the spot. Not saying it's not important, not saying it's not a command, but for salvation. And therefore, in order to really go further, in my opinion, these things have to be explained first. The argument has to be made, if you want to go deeper than that, you want to go further, then I'm going to need somebody to explain those to me first, because even if they say, well, there's countless verses that talk about baptism and salvation, but as we talked about earlier, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of what takes place on the inside. Therefore, that doesn't necessarily mean right off the bat that you have to be baptized to be saved. But we do have solid truth that points to the opposite. Therefore, really, if you're going to have that conversation with people, I would start with those two things. Or maybe you yourself believe it, and therefore maybe you can get in contact with us and take it further. But honestly, in order to go further, I would start there.
Yeah, and I would also say, if you are someone who believes in this, or believes that baptism is required for sin, we're not trying to tell you, we're kind of trying to tell you we don't agree with you, but we're not phrasing it in the way that you're wrong and we're right. This forum of discussion is started so that we can challenge the beliefs of people who